They expected bread, maybe potatoes, maybe coffee. But on one quiet morning in an American POW camp, a tray arrived with a bowl filled with small crisp flakes and a little sugar. And several prisoners hesitated because it looked more like a dessert than a meal. And as milk was poured over it, one of them quietly wondered why anyone would start the day with something that tasted sweet, light, and almost like a treat instead of real food, which raised a simple but unsettling question in their minds. Was this truly breakfast, or had they misunderstood something about how Americans ate? On their first mornings inside American camps, many German prisoners tried to read their surroundings carefully because small details often revealed how life would function in this unfamiliar system. And food was one of the clearest signals, since meals arrived on schedule and followed patterns that soon became predictable. Yet predictability did not mean familiarity, because what appeared on the trays sometimes differed from what these men associated with a proper morning meal. And among those differences, the bowl of cereal stood out, not as a luxury, but as a puzzle, since in their experience breakfast was meant to be dense, filling, and practical, often centered around bread, spreads, or leftovers from previous meals, while this new item seemed light in weight yet oddly sweet in taste. And sweetness in the morning did not fit their habits, because sugar in wartime Europe had been rationed and used carefully, which meant sweet flavors were linked more with rare treats than daily routine. So when they encountered cereal, they did not immediately see it as nourishment, but as something closer to a snack. And this interpretation shaped their first reactions, which were quiet and observant rather than dramatic, because prisoners quickly learned that careful observation helped them understand their new environment better than assumptions did. The cereal itself arrived in plain bowls, usually accompanied by milk. And the milk was another small difference, since many of them were more accustomed to coffee or substitutes in the morning. So the combination of cold milk and crisp grains created a sensory contrast that drew attention. And some prisoners examined the flakes before eating, touching them lightly, noticing how easily they broke. And this texture differed from the dense foods they associated with energy for the day's labor, which led to private doubts about whether such a meal could be sufficient. Yet as days passed and routines formed, they saw that the cereal appeared regularly, and that men who ate it functioned normally through work assignments, which slowly reframed their understanding from suspicion to curiosity. Among the prisoners were men from farms and small towns who had experience with grains and milling, and these men sometimes speculated quietly about how the cereal was produced, recognizing that it must be processed differently from bread flour. And this practical reasoning helped them place the food within an agricultural context rather than viewing it as something symbolic. Because once a food is understood as a product of process and availability, it becomes less mysterious. In America's large grain production likely made such foods common, especially when industrial processing allowed long storage and easy transport, which suited camp logistics, and logistics often determine menus more than preference does. Still, the idea of starting a day with something mildly sweet remained unusual in their minds, because cultural habits form over years and do not shift instantly. And these men had lived through years where calories mattered more than flavor. So a breakfast that included sweetness suggested a different relationship with food, one shaped by supply stability and consumer habits rather than strict rationing. And recognizing this difference did not change their situation, but added a layer to how they interpreted their surroundings, since daily life in captivity is understood not only through rules, but through repeated small experiences that reveal how another society operates. Over time, the cereal became part of the background of camp life. Yet those first impressions stayed in memory, because first encounters with unfamiliar foods often leave clearer marks than later routine does, And these memories later appeared in personal accounts where former prisoners describe how ordinary meals highlighted the contrast between wartime Europe and the American home front, showing that even during a global conflict, everyday life could look very different depending on where one stood. And in this way, a simple bowl of cereal became one of the early signals that captivity in America would involve not only confinement, but also constant exposure to cultural differences expressed through the most ordinary details. As the days turned into weeks, the presence of cereal at breakfast no longer felt like a one-time curiosity, but part of a structured routine. And routine inside a camp carried importance because it shaped how prisoners measured time, since predictable schedules made long periods of confinement mentally manageable. And within that structure, the cereal remained a small but noticeable detail, appearing in similar bowls, in similar portions, often alongside bread or simple sides. And this regularity slowly signaled that the food was not experimental or improvised, but normal within the system that supplied the camps, which suggested a larger food network operating beyond the fences. Because such consistency requires organized production, packaging, and transport, and several prisoners began to understand that what seemed unusual to them might simply be common elsewhere. Some men approached the cereal practically, treating it as fuel rather than questioning its form, since hunger tends to reduce philosophical thinking. Yet others continued to observe quietly, noting how American staff handled the food without hesitation, pouring milk over the flakes as if it were an unquestioned habit. And this casualness revealed that the combination was culturally standard, not a special arrangement for prisoners. And this realization shifted the meaning from confusion toward cultural difference, because when something is routine for one group and unfamiliar to another, the difference often lies in habit rather than intention. Among the prisoners were individuals who had worked in food trades or agriculture before the war, and these men sometimes discussed how grain could be processed into many forms beyond bread, including flattened or toasted products designed for storage and quick preparation. And such explanations grounded the cereal in agricultural logic rather than novelty, since processed grains could last longer and be transported efficiently, which fit the needs of large institutions like camps. And institutions often prioritize practicality and shelf stability, and recognizing this helped reduce the sense that the cereal was unusual treatment. The milk itself also carried meaning, because dairy availability reflects local farming capacity, and the United States had strong dairy production in many regions, which allowed milk to appear regularly in meals. And for men from areas where fresh milk was less accessible during wartime, this reliability signaled how geography and infrastructure influence diet, and this influence operates quietly, shaping what people consider normal without them noticing until they encounter a different system. Over time, the sweetness of the cereal stopped feeling like a surprise and became a familiar flavor, though not necessarily a preferred one for everyone. And this illustrates how adaptation works in gradual steps, where repeated exposure turns difference in a background, and background details rarely draw attention unless they change. And since the cereal remained consistent, it faded into routine while still contributing to the broader impression that daily life in America followed patterns, unlike those shaped by wartime scarcity in Europe. These observations did not transform their circumstances and did not lessen the reality of captivity. Yet they added informational layers to how prisoners interpreted their environment, because understanding how things function can reduce uncertainty, and reduced uncertainty supports mental steadiness, which matters in long confinement. And thus, even a simple breakfast item played a small role in how they oriented themselves within an unfamiliar system. By this stage, the cereal no longer prompted silent questions at the table, but the memory of its first appearance remained as a marker of cultural contrast, a reminder that ordinary habits vary across societies, and that such variation continues even during global conflict, shaped by land, industry, and local practice more than by ideology. And in this quiet way, the bowl of cereal became one more example of how daily life reveals differences between worlds, one morning at a time. As familiarity grew and the cereal became a regular part of breakfast, the conversations around it slowly shifted from surprise toward explanation. Because once a difference repeats often enough, the human mind tries to categorize it logically, and several prisoners began connecting what they saw on their trays to what they knew about farming, milling, and food storage. Since many of them came from rural regions where grain production was common, and they understood that wheat, corn, and oats could be processed in multiple ways depending on need and technology. And this awareness helped them see the cereal not as a strange invention, but as a product of industrial food systems that prioritized efficiency, preservation, and transport, which were important for feeding large populations and institutions. An American industry during the 1940s had the capacity to process grain into ready-to-eat forms that required minimal preparation, and such foods suited organized environments where meals had to be served quickly and consistently. Some prisoners observed how cereal required less baking fuel and kitchen labor compared to bread, since it arrived already processed and only needed portioning in milk. And this efficiency likely appealed to camp kitchens managing many men on fixed schedules, because large-scale meal preparation depends on timing and predictability, and cereal fit those requirements well. And recognizing this framed the food as a logistical choice rather than a cultural statement, since institutions often choose what is practical, and practicality rarely considers personal habits. The sweetness, which initially drew attention, gradually felt less pronounced as their palates adjusted, because taste adapts over time, especially when exposure is regular. And what once felt like a treat becomes neutral through repetition. And this process illustrates how sensory perception is flexible, shaped by experience as much as by ingredients. And prisoners who had lived through rationing noticed that their sensitivity to sugar had changed during the war years, since limited access makes sweetness stand out more, and consistent access makes it feel ordinary. And this contrast reminded them how environment influences perception. At the tables, reactions varied quietly, with some men eating cereal without thought, while others prefer to combine it with bread or other items to create a more familiar feeling of fullness. And these small personal adjustments showed how individuals maintain comfort within limited options. Because even in controlled settings, people find ways to shape routine to their preferences. And food offers one of the few areas where minor choice exists, and minor choice can support a sense of personal control. Guards and kitchen staff treated the cereal with the same neutrality as other foods, offering no explanation because none was needed from their perspective, and this neutrality reinforced that the item was standard, not symbolic. And when something is standard, it rarely invites comment, which further signaled that the difference lay in cultural habit rather than policy. And understanding this helped some prisoners view the food as part of a broader pattern of American daily life rather than as a unique feature of captivity. Over time, cereal joined the list of ordinary details that defined camp mornings alongside trays, benches, and scheduled calls. And while it did not carry emotional weight, it contributed to the steady rhythm that structured their days. And structure can make long periods feel more manageable because it reduces unpredictability, and unpredictability often weighs heavily on the mind. In this way, the cereal completed its transition from curiosity to routine, illustrating how adaptation works through repeated exposure and practical understanding, and how even small food items can quietly teach lessons about another country's agriculture, industry, and habits without any formal explanation. and these lessons accumulated in memory, forming part of how former prisoners later described the everyday contrast they observed, showing that history is often experienced through ordinary moments as much as through major events, one breakfast at a time. As the weeks turned into months, the cereal gradually lost its sense of novelty, because repetition has a quiet way of turning unusual things into expected ones. And once the same bowl appeared morning after morning, the men no longer studied it closely or questioned its place on the tray, since the mind naturally stops focusing on details that prove consistent. And consistency inside a camp carried its own meaning, because predictable food suggested a stable supply system operating beyond the fences. And for prisoners who had lived through fluctuating rations in Europe, this steadiness was noticeable even if it was not discussed openly. The cereal also fit well into the camp schedule because it could be served quickly and required little preparation compared to baked goods, and large camps depended on meals moving in orderly lines. So foods that saved time and labor were practical choices, and practicality often shaped institutional menus more than tradition did, which meant the cereal's presence likely reflected kitchen logistics rather than cultural messaging. Some prisoners adjusted their habits around it, eating the cereal first and saving bread for later, or mixing foods to create a meal that felt more filling. And these small decisions matter because food was one of the few areas where personal preference could still operate, and even limited choice can support a sense of control in a controlled environment, helping men maintain mental balance during long periods of routine. They also understood by now that such foods must be common among American civilians, because large-scale production only exists when there is large-scale demand, and this realization quietly broadened their picture of daily life outside the camp, showing that American breakfasts often included processed grain products, milk, and mild sweetness, which differed from the heavier, ration-shaped breakfasts they associated with wartime Europe. The guards' neutral handling of the cereal reinforced its normality, since no explanation or emphasis ever accompanied it. And when something is truly ordinary, it rarely receives comment, and this lack of ceremony helped prisoners see the cereal as part of a system rather than a special provision. By this stage, the cereal blended fully into the background of camp life, appearing alongside trays, benches, and morning counts as another predictable element of the day. And predictability, even when imposed, can reduce mental strain because it removes uncertainty, and uncertainty often weighs more heavily than monotony. Still, some men quietly remembered their first reaction, because first impressions tend to stay longer than later routines, and that memory served as a small reminder of how different their surroundings were from what they had known before, not in dramatic ways, but in ordinary details. In this steady shift from curiosity to acceptance, the cereal illustrated how people adapt through exposure and explanation, turning unfamiliar experiences into routine facts, and showing that even within confinement, daily life continues to teach quiet lessons about the wider world, one simple breakfast at a time. As their time in the camps continued, many prisoners reached a point where they no longer compared every detail to home, because constant comparison is mentally exhausting, and the mind eventually creates a temporary sense of normal based on what it sees each day. And within that adjustment, the cereal became simply part of breakfast, neither strange nor noteworthy, yet it still carried informational value about the country providing it, since food systems reflect agriculture, industry, and transport networks more than individual preference. And recognizing this allowed some prisoners to interpret what they experienced in practical terms rather than emotional ones. They understood by then that the United States possessed large grain production and food processing industries capable of turning crops into long-lasting, ready-to-eat products. And this capacity explained why cereal appeared regularly and in similar form. Because standardized production leads to standardized meals, and standardized meals suit large institutions where efficiency matters. And this explanation replaced earlier speculation with context, and context often brings mental steadiness. In confined environments, the serial also illustrated how wartime conditions were not identical everywhere. Since American farmland had not faced the same destruction seen in parts of Europe, and this geographic difference influenced what civilians and prisoners alike received on their plates. And seeing this chain of cause and effect helped some men understand that daily life in America operated under different pressures, shaped by distance from battle zones and strong domestic production. For the prisoners, these realizations did not change their status and did not reduce the limits placed on them. Yet they contributed to a clearer picture of the society around them. Because captivity is lived not only through rules, but through repeated exposure to how another system functions. And food often provides the most direct evidence of that system. Some men later recalled that what stayed in memory was not the taste itself, but the contrast with scarcity they had known before, because scarcity sharpens awareness. And when regular meals replace irregular ones, the difference becomes noticeable even if it is not discussed aloud. And this contrast quietly shaped how they remembered their early days in American camps. Over time, the cereal no longer represented sweetness or novelty, but reliability. And reliability can influence morale because it signals that tomorrow's meal will likely resemble today's. And predictable meals help structure long stretches of confinement where few variables change. By the end of this period, the cereal stood as a small example of how ordinary items reveal larger systems, showing how agriculture, industry, and culture shape daily life. And these lessons arrived not through instruction, but through repetition. And repetition often teaches more effectively than explanation. In this way, a simple bowl of cereal completed its journey from curiosity to accepted routine, illustrating how adaptation works step by step, and how even within confinement people continue to observe, learn, and build understanding from the smallest details placed in front of them each morning. In the end, the cereal did not change their situation, did not soften the reality of captivity, and did not carry any hidden meaning. Yet remained one of those small details through which the difference between expectation and reality became visible, because the men had arrived with memories of rationing, scarcity, and heavy breakfasts shaped by necessity, and instead they encountered a system where processed grains, milk, and mild sweetness were part of normal daily life, and this contrast revealed how geography and industry influence what people consider ordinary. What began as quiet confusion slowly turned into practical understanding, as repeated exposure showed that the cereal was not a treat, but a standard food shaped by American agriculture and large-scale production. And recognizing this helped replace speculation with context, and context allowed prisoners to interpret their surroundings calmly rather than emotionally, which supported mental steadiness during long confinement. For many of the men, the lesson was not about liking the taste, but about realizing that daily life continues differently in different places even during a global war, and that difference can be noticed in the simplest routines, such as what appears in a breakfast bowl, because food reflects the land that produces it and the systems that distribute it. Over time, the cereal blended fully into routine and lost its novelty. Yet the memory of that first unfamiliar breakfast often remained, because first impressions tend to anchor how people recall new environments. And those impressions later appeared in personal recollections, describing how American camp life contrasted with wartime Europe in quiet, everyday ways. Many visible traces of POW life disappeared after the war, but memories of daily experiences lasted longer. And small moments like these helped form how former prisoners describe captivity. not only through fences and regulations, but through ordinary details that revealed cultural contrast. And so the story of Assyriel settles as a modest example of how adaptation works, showing that even in confinement, people continue to observe, compare, and learn, and that history is often experienced through small daily encounters as much as through major events. With a simple breakfast quietly illustrating how different worlds can meet across a table during time of war. Thank you for spending this time here. If these quiet, true World War II stories matter to you, subscribing helps this channel continue.